Greetings, bibliophiles. Welcome back to The Book Thing. And I realise it's been a bit of a gap since the last one of these that I did, and I've actually gotten a bit behind with the books, but it's not the first time. And I had a bit of a gap on the main channel as well, so it's not that I was particularly ignoring this channel, it's just things fell off a bit generally. But here we are. So I'm going to start with the book that I'm furthest behind with, if that makes any sense. The one that I'm doing these in order of when I read them is what I mean. I'm confusing myself here. Just ignore me. It's probably safest. So, yeah, The Years of Rice and Salt by Kim Stanley Robinson. This one's a reread. I've read it a good couple of times at this point, and it's a bit of a favourite of mine because it's a really good book. It did take me a while to get through it. It's a rather weighty affair. It's over, 700, nearly 800 pages in the paperback. And the density of the language at times makes it not the most page-turning book ever. But it's really good. Which is that's obviously a very nuanced critical statement there, but I really do like it a lot. And you know, I'm not the only one that thought it was really good because it was nominated for several awards and actually won. Let's see, it was a Locus Award. There we go. So not one of the more well-known sci-fi awards, but you know, it was nominated for a bunch of things, including the Arthur C. Clarke and the Hugo. So what is it? Well, as I've said, it's alt history. And the premise, the conceit is that back in the 12th century, when the Black Death was raging around Europe, it was even more virulent than it was in real life and basically ended up wiping out Christendom, the entirety of Western Europe. Well, almost wiping out the entirety of Western Europe. And although it hit other areas of the world as well, you know, Central Asia and Arabia, they were hit much less hard. And so what happens is that Europe becomes completely depopulated, and he goes on to imagine from there an alternate world history where the powers, the other powers in the world, you know, the Islamic sphere and China, and then later on there's various other rising groups of people, all not scramble to fill the gap, but the way in which things work out without that Western European influence on world history and how things end up being different or in some cases the same. It is, of course, entirely a work of imagination because it's starting from so far back, so it really does give one free rein to potentially go to some quite wacky places. But generally speaking, he tries to keep it in line with the various places and cultures and extrapolate from there and imagine how they might have evolved free of that European influence. And he does it in a really interesting way. Now, the other conceit that's in this book is that reincarnation is a thing, and what we actually end up doing in our journey through this alternate history is following the same group of characters over and over again as they live through different lives. And towards the end, he actually throws in a little a kind of a thing where he points out, and it might be based on actual histories of various cultures where they have tied the names of people together across different generations to try and posit that they are the same soul coming back over and over again. But that's exactly what he does do, and it actually quite makes it clear that in the context of the book, this is actually happening. These people are actually being reincarnated over and over again. So there's no kind of like this may or may not be happening. It's definitely happening. These are definitely the same characters. But as long as you can suspend your disbelief that far, which, considering the nature of the alt history to begin with, you've got to have a bit of suspension of disbelief anyway. It makes for a pretty good conceit, and it also means that you get this familiar group of characters. It's almost like they're Time Lords regenerating through the ages, and so they're, you know, different, but they have some similar characteristics every time, and so they kind of react to some of the situations in certain ways that you grow to expect as it goes down through the ages. So it's a really interesting way of doing it, and it's not something I've seen done in other contemporary fiction, but it's probably not a new idea. It's probably something that's been taken from somewhere, and he's given it this modern twist. So there are I think something like 10 books overall, and one of the interesting things is that I say books, like 10 chapters, 10 epochs, if you like, within the book that it covers. What was I going to say? One of the things that does change as you go through is actually the style of writing itself, and it's pretty distinctive at the start, and there's various other eras where it does also have quite a distinctive style to it, and then you get right through to the end and it hits what we would think of as being the modern era, and it's just very, very kind of straight modern fiction as a style, but it kind of evolves in that way. And I actually had a friend of mine that I recommended this to, and he was really disappointed when he got through the very first bit where it's a couple of Mongol soldiers who, they're scouting through the ruins of Europe, basically, and finding all these eerily empty villages and towns. And he was really disappointed that the language didn't stay the same as in that first section, because he really loved it, and he thought it was quite, what was it he said? Something like it was quite poetic or whatever. And then, of course, later on it changes, because that's the nature of the book. The whole thing of the novel, there's probably a much better word there than thing, but it's change, and it's how people stay the same, but how change happens anyway, and it's this kind of interplay of history, and sometimes the characters are having things happen to them, and other times the characters are actually the ones that are making the change themselves, and it's all very varied. It doesn't have any one particular thing that it's trying to ram home, that sometimes novels like this do. They have some kind of central message that they just try and hammer into your skull over and over again. But no, there's a lot of variety and variation in this. And like I said, it's like following a group of Time Lords that don't know they're Time Lords. They're just continuously regenerating through the ages and rediscovering each other as they go along. So it's a very dense novel in some places, but I think overall it's a very rewarding novel, and there's a reason why I keep coming back to it. And Kim Stanley Robinson himself, I think he's quite an interesting author. The other novels he's written that I am particularly fond of are the Mars trilogy, which are a bit like Lord of the Rings. You can think of it as being a trilogy, but really it's just one really long book in 3 parts. But this is a very different novel, and it's got a kind of almost a spiritual basis to it that you don't find in a lot of works. It's hard to... I think it's a thing that's hard to do well, because you get a lot of what you might call like Christian fiction or whatever, where, like I said, everything's just being, really absolutely rammed home, and there's no subtlety to it whatsoever. But I think with Kim Stanley Robinson, he's the kind of person that takes a lot of ideas on board, a bit like Terry Pratchett, and it all kind of seeps in, and you can see the influences, and you can see maybe some of the thinking that's gone in behind it. But it's not trying to convert anybody. It's not trying to say, well, this is the truth and anything else is just lies and heresy. It's trying to make you think about things and maybe see different points of view. And you almost have to, because it's jumping back and forth between these characters in different times and different places. Sometimes they're Islamic characters, sometimes they're in, there's one section where they're in a really rural, poor part of India, and they're Hindu characters, and there are other times when they are in the midst of the Chinese bureaucracy, and there's all kinds of, different times and places. And actually in the earlier parts, I'm trying to think where it would maybe get more a bit divergent, but you actually get some real historical characters turning up. I think Tamerlane is in the first section, and you get the Chinese Admiral Zheng He, which I've probably horribly mispronounced, as a character coming up later on. And I think there's a couple of the Chinese emperors that are actually... and there's the emperor of the Mughal Empire, Akbar, is in there as a character. And so you've got this almost like familiarity going through the first part, and then it starts to get more and more divergent as time goes along, and as history splits away from what we know more and more, and it becomes more speculative maybe, but it's still kind of like you can see the influences of our own history. He doesn't go completely hog wild with it. He does stick to there's kind of a Renaissance kind of era, and there's a great World War era, and then we come to a kind of a modern atomic age at the end, and it's all it's familiar and it's different at the same time. And I think that's the genius of this, that he didn't just kind of slavishly try and like transcribe our own history, but make it, with different names or whatever, but it's different enough that it feels like, this could actually have happened. And it's good. It's a good book is what I'm trying to say. It's maybe not for the faint of heart, but I think it's certainly a very rewarding read. So the section I've got to read out is actually from the kind of Renaissance era that actually takes place in Samarkand, and it's from a section called The Alchemist. Now, it so happened that as the time approached for the great alchemist's red work to reach its culmination in the final multiplication, the projection of the Sophic hydrolith into the ferment, causing tincture, that is to say, the transmuting of base metals into gold, the son-in-law of the alchemist, one Bahram al-Bukhara, ran and jostled through the bazaar of Samarkand on last-minute errands, ignoring the calls of his various friends and creditors. "I can't stop," he called. "I'm late." "Late paying your debts," said Divendi, whose coffee stall was wedged into a slot next to Iwang's workshop. "True," Bahram said, but stopped for a coffee anyway. "Always late, but never bored. Khalid keeps you hopping." "Literally so. Yesterday, the big pelican cracked during a descension, and it spilled right next to me. Vitriol of Cyprus mixed with sal ammoniac." "Dangerous?" "Oh my god, where it splashed on my trousers, the cloth was eaten away, and the smoke was worse. I had to run for my life." "As always." "So true. I coughed my guts out, my eyes ran all night. It was like drinking your coffee." "I always make yours from the dregs." "I know," tossing down the last gritty shot. "So, are you coming tomorrow?" "To see lead turned into gold? I'll be there." Iwang's workshop was dominated by its brick furnace. Familiar sizzle and smell of a bellowed fire, tink of hammer, glowing molten glass, Iwang twirling the rod attentively. Bahram greeted the glassblower and silversmith. "Khalid wants more of the wolf." "Khalid always wants more of the wolf." Iwang continued turning his blob of hot glass. Tall and broad and big-faced, a Tibetan by birth, but long a resident of Samarkand, he was one of Khalid's closest associates. Did he send payment this time? Of course not. He said to put it on the tab. Iwang pursed his lips. He's got too many tabs these days. All paid after tomorrow. He finished the 777th distillation. Iwang put down his work and went to a wall stacked with boxes. He handed Bahram a small leather pouch, heavy with small beads of lead. "Gold grows in the earth," he said. "Al-Razi himself couldn't grow it in a crucible." "Khalid would debate that, and Al-Razi lived a long time ago. He couldn't get the heat we can now." "Maybe." Iwang was sceptical. "Tell him to be careful." "Of burning himself?" "Of the Khan burning him." "You'll be there to see it?" Iwang nodded reluctantly. The day of the demonstration came, and for a wonder, the great Khalid Ali Abu al-Samarkandi seemed nervous, and Bahram could understand why. If Sayyid Abdul Aziz Khan, ruler of the Khanate of Bukhara, immensely rich and powerful, chose to support Khalid's enterprises, all would be well. But he was not a man you wanted to disappoint. Even his closest advisor, the Treasury Secretary Nadir Devanbegi, avoided disappointing him at all costs. Recently, for instance, Nadir had caused a new caravanserai to be built on the east side of Bukhara, and the Khan had been brought out for its opening ceremony, and being a bit inattentive by nature, he had congratulated them for building such a fine madrasa. And rather than correct him on the point, Nadir had ordered the complex turned into a madrasa. This was the kind of Khan Sayyid Abdul Aziz was, and he was the Khan to whom Khalid was going to demonstrate the tincture. It was enough to make Bahram's stomach tight and his pulse fast, and while Khalid sounded like he always did, sharp and impatient and sure of himself, Bahram could see that his face was unusually pale. But he had worked on the projection for years and studied all the alchemical texts he could obtain, including many bought by Bahram in the Hindu caravanserai, including the Book of the End of the Search by Jildaki, and Jabir ibn Hayyam's Book of Balances, as well as The Secret of Secrets, once thought to be lost, and the Chinese text Reference Book for the Penetration of Reality. And Khalid had, in his extensive workshops, the mechanical capability to repeat the required distillations at high heat and very good clarities, all 777 times. 2 weeks earlier, he had declared that his final efforts had borne fruit, and now he was ready for a public demonstration, which of course had to include regal witnesses to matter. So Bahram turned around in Khalid's compound on the northern edge of Samarkand, sprawling by the banks of the Zervashan River, which provided power to the foundries and the various workshops. The walls of the establishment were ringed by great heaps of charcoal waiting to be burned, and inside there were a number of buildings loosely grouped around the central work area, a yard dotted with vats and discoloured chemical baths. Several different stinks combined to form the single harsh smell that was particular to Khalid's place. He was the Khanate's principal gunpowder producer and metallurgist, among other things, and these practical enterprises supported the alchemy that was his ruling passion. Bahram wove through the clutter, making sure the demonstration area was ready. The long tables in the open-walled shops were crowded with an orderly array of equipment. The walls of the shops were neatly hung with tools. The main athanor was roaring with heat. But Khalid was not to be found. The puffers had not seen him. Bahram's wife Esmerine, Khalid's daughter, had not seen him. The house at the back of the compound seemed empty, and no one answered Bahram's calls. He began to wonder if Khalid had run away in fear. Then Khalid appeared out of the library next to his study, the only room in the compound with a door that locked. "There you are," Bahram said. "Come on, father. Al-Razi and Mary the Jewess will be no help to you now. It's time to show the world the thing itself, the projection." Khalid, startled to see him, nodded curtly. "I was making the last preparations," he said. He led Bahram to the furnace shed, where the geared bellows, powered by the water wheel on the river, pumped air into the roaring fires. The Khan and his party arrived quite late, when much of the afternoon was spent. 20 horsemen thundered in, their finery gleaming, and then a camel train 50 beasts long, all foaming at the gallop. The Khan dismounted from his white bay and walked across the yard with Nadir Devembegi at his side, and several court officials at their heels. Khalid's attempt at a formal greeting, including the presentation of a gift of one of his most cherished alchemical books, was cut short by Sayyid Abdul Aziz. "Show us," the Khan commanded, taking the book without looking at it. Khalid bowed. "The alembic I used is this one here, called a pelican. The base matter is mostly calcinated lead with some mercurials. They have been projected by continuous distillation and redistillation until all the matter has passed through the pelican 777 times. At that point, the spirit in the lion, well, to put it in a more worldly term, the gold, condenses out at the highest athanor heat. So we pour the wolf into this vessel and put that in the athanor and wait for an hour, stirring meanwhile 7 times. Show us." The Khan was clearly bored by the details. Without further ado, Khalid led them into the furnace shed, and his assistants opened the heavy thick door of the athanor, and, after allowing the visitors to handle and inspect the ceramic bowl, Khalid grabbed up the tongs and poured the grey distillate into the bowl and placed the tray in the athanor and slid it into the intense heat. The air over the furnace shimmered as Sayyid Abdul Aziz's mullah said prayers, and Khalid watched the second hand of his best clock. Every 5 minutes he gestured to the puffers, who opened the door and pulled out the tray, at which point Khalid stirred the liquid metal, now glowing orange, with his ladle 7 times in 7 circles, and then back into the heat of the fire. In the last minutes of the operation, the crackle of the charcoal was the only sound in the yard. The sweating observers, including many acquaintances from the town, watched the clock tick out the last minute of the hour in a silence like that of Sufis in a trance of speechlessness, or, like, Barham thought uneasily, hawks inspecting the ground far below. Finally, Khalid nodded to the puffers, and he himself hefted the bowl off the tray with big tongs and carried it to a table in the yard, cleared for the demonstration. "Now we pour off the dross, great Khan," paddling the molten lead out of the bowl into a stone tub on the table, "and at the bottom we see... ah." He smiled and wiped his forehead with his sleeve, gestured at the bowl. Even when molten, it gleams to the eye. At the bottom of the bowl, the liquid was a darker red. With a spatula, Khalid carefully skimmed off the remaining dross, and there at the bottom of the bowl lay a cooling mass of liquid gold. "We can pour it into a bar mould while it's still soft," Khalid said with a quiet satisfaction. "It looks to be perhaps 10 ounces. That would be 1/7 of the stock, as predicted." Saeed Abdul Aziz's face shone like the gold. He turned to his secretary, Nadir Devenbegi, who was regarding the ceramic bowl closely. Without expression, Nadir gestured for one of the Khan's guards to come forward. The rest of them rustled behind the alchemist's crew. Their pikes were still upright, but they were now at attention. "Seize the instruments," Nadir told the head guard. 3 soldiers helped him take possession of all the tools used in the operation, including the great pelican itself. When they were all in hand, Nadir went to one guard and took up the ladle Khalid had used to steer the liquid metals. In a sudden move, he smashed it down on the table. It rang like a bell. He looked over at Saeed Abdul Aziz, who stared at his secretary, puzzled. Nadir gestured with his head to one of the pikemen, then put the ladle on the table. "Cut it." The pike came down hard, and the ladle was sliced just above its scoop. Nadir picked up the handle and the scoop and inspected them. He showed them to the Khan. "You see, the shaft is hollow. The gold was in the tube inside the handle, and when he stirred, the heat melted the gold and it slid out into the lead in the bowl. Then, as he continued to stir, it moved to the bottom of the bowl." Barham looked at Khalid, shocked, and saw that it was true. His father-in-law's face was white, and he was no longer sweating, already a dead man. The Khan roared wordlessly, then leapt at Khalid and struck him down with the book he had been given. He beat him with the book, and Khalid did not resist. "Take him!" Saeed Abdul Aziz shouted at his soldiers. They picked up Khalid by the arms and dragged him through the dust, not allowing him to get to his feet, and threw him over a camel. In less than a minute they were all gone from the compound, leaving the air filled with smoke and dust and echoing shouts. So that's the start of that chapter. He doesn't actually die, but after that he ends up kind of renouncing alchemy almost, and then taking a great interest in the scientific method, except of course they didn't have a scientific method, so basically but they were inventing it, and the rest of that is all kind of about experiments and this kind of fever of experimentation and methodology that ends up gripping him, and it's one of the more interesting bits of the book, I think. And you later on in later chapters, in later stories almost, get references back to the Samarkand flowering, as they call it, which is basically the equivalent of our Renaissance, when they start to, think about the world in a more scientific way. So, there's lots of good things about this book, and if you're a fan of good alt history, I would absolutely recommend this book. And just Kim Stanley Robinson generally. I don't think he's done any other alt history. No, actually, well, he kind of has. He's done some alt. No, he hasn't done alt history. He's done some kind of future speculative stuff, and he's done some stuff you would just call straight sci-fi. But no, this is his only alt history, so okay. But I think he's a good author anyway, is what I'm trying to say. But if you want something that's an easy read, if you would struggle with keeping track of characters over a long book, or if you just, don't like the style of writing that you heard a little snippet of there, it's a lot of that. And even for myself that really likes it, it took me a while to get through it. It's not really a book I can sit down and just read huge swathes of in one go. It's one of those novels where I just kind of digest it a little bit at a time. And because it's a long novel, it therefore then took me rather a long time to get through. So, even so, I think it's pretty good though, and if you think it sounds at all interesting, then absolutely it's recommended. So, that's that for this episode. There'll be some others following in fairly short order. The most recent book, actually, in contrast to Years of Rice and Salt, the most recent book I read, I finished in just 2 days, so that was of a rather different quality indeed. Even though it was a shorter book, it's still fairly unusual for me to sit down and do that. But I won't talk about that now, because I'll be getting ahead of myself. So if you enjoyed this episode, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, maybe with some other alt history recommendations, I don't know. You can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.